Now, when you buy your Bareroot roses, they will usually come in a cardboard box, kind of like this, and wrapped in a plastic bag. And the plastic bag is there to prevent the moisture from evaporating and the roses from drying out during transportation. The next thing you want to do with your Bareroot roses is you want to pick them out of the plastic, of course, and then you want to find a bucket, and you want to pour water into the bucket, and you want to hydrate your roses. Ideally you want to get the grafting point under the water, kind of like this, but because this is a bucket of water, it's kind of small, I haven't been able to do that. But if you have the option to do that, try to get them in as deep as possible. You don't want to cover the green part of the plant, but you do want to cover it up to around the union up here. So try to cover the roots in as much water as possible. Now, I do find it useful to remember one thing. We're doing this to hydrate the roses, and I would say you should max do this for around 48 hours. A minimum around 2 to 3 hours, and maximum around 48 hours. The reason for that is roses actually do need oxygen, and when they're completely stuck in water, if you just leave them there for long periods of time, like 2 weeks, they will eventually start to rot, because roses do need oxygen just like they need water. They trade oxygen and water often when they're in the soil, and that is also why very loose soil is important when you're planting your roses, because you want to secure that airflow to the root. But one thing I like to do, if in doubt for how long to leave the roses in water, is simply to look at your soil outside. Is your soil outside very wet? Is it very dry? If it is very dry outside, I would definitely leave them for 48 hours. Really hydrate them before placing them outside. But if your soil is already very wet, very dense, I would not give them much more than a day at most, maybe even just 5 to 6 hours at most. So do notice how wet your soil is. If it is very wet, you don't need to hydrate them as much. If it is very dry, really go for that deep hydration when you're planting your Bareroot roses. And Bareroot roses come in many different shapes. You'll notice when a rose is called A quality, that means it has 3 of these stems, and they have to be at least a pencil width in thickness. So that is how you tell A quality rose. 3 of these stems at the thickness of a pencil. Now these are grafted roses. You can see the union and grafting point down here. So these are not own root, these are grafted. If you didn't have this union point, and you can always see the union point because it is kind of like this clump at the end of the rose, because this rose is a multiflora that has been cut here, and then they have made this T incision with a knife, and then they have stuck a branch of another rose in here, and then they have tied it up, and that is why you get this kind of like a tumor growth here, I guess, kind of like a knot, really. And that is why you can always tell a grafted rose, because you can tell it's been cut off here, and you can tell this round knot sticking out. But yeah, remember to hydrate your roses. It is important, but do remember to holistically look at the weather around you. Is it very wet? You don't need to hydrate them for as long as if it's very dry soil you're placing them out to. And do remember, they do need air, so don't go above those 2 days, really. You can maybe get away with 3, but I wouldn't push it into the multiple weeks. So I'll go into, if you want to store them for multiple weeks, I'll show you a method in just a second. But let's continue here. Now I thought I would illustrate at which planting depth to plant your Bareroot plant, because that part can be a bit difficult to spot when we're out in the garden. Often looking down into a hole from this distance, it can be very difficult to see what is going on. Now there are 3 types of ways to plant your bare root plant. There's actually many, but I'll go over 3 here. If you live somewhere very warm, you can get away with just covering the crown here. And the crown is of course this right here in the center, right here. And in a warm place you can get away with just covering that, because you don't have a lot of tough winters to worry about, so you don't have to worry that much about dieback. The reason you do want to cover the crown is because you'll get wild shoots from the original root if you don't. If you live in America, it will most likely be grafted onto Dr. Huey. If living in Europe, it will most likely be multiflora that will cause wild shoots for you. So do remember, you don't want to leave this root part down here exposed, because then that root will start to shoot and it won't be the same as the rose you have ordered if you have a grafted rose. A quick way to tell you how a grafted rose is like the cut has been cut off here, like I explained before, and you have this kind of scion out at the outer edge here. An own root rose doesn't have that cutting point up here. So another way you can do it is in a moderate climate, and in a moderate climate we do get tough winters. So what we want to do is put the crown a bit further down into the soil, so our soil level is around here, around 5 centimeters on top of the crown. And this will help the plant in many ways. For the first point is the crown is protected by the soil against the harsh winter. Another point to make is all these nodes on the branches around here will start forming roots, and those will anchor the rose to the soil better, so it doesn't get knocked about by the wind and can make these rocking motions. So that is another advantage with doing it this way, where you add a bit of soil, about 5 centimeters of soil. If you live somewhere it gets really cold, like hopefully you're not trying to grow roses on the North Pole, but if you're living somewhere like Canada, you might want to put it up even further to protect the crown against the environments, against the tough winters. The issue with that is roses do tend to rot the higher you go. So it's not all cost-free to just go higher and higher. They do tend to rot the more deeply you bury them. But if you live somewhere where the winter is the biggest threat, I would definitely bury my roses a little bit deeper. But for most of you, I would say around this level is the most ideal, around the 5 centimeters on top. If you live somewhere like Australia, a very warm place, you can probably get away with this, right? Or just covering the crown of it. But you do have to be careful, because if it is also windy and you don't anchor it correctly, you can get that rocking motion. So there's definitely plus sides and downsides. You can of course also go with this, just covering the crown, and then put some soil on top, kind of like a molehill or something like that. A little hill of earth on top. And of course, when spring comes around, you'll remove this earth pile you created. You'll remove that off the rose, and then it'll be fine again. So that's just a temporary solution. Really, if you know you're going to get a couple of rough winter days, you can go out and pile up some soil around your roses to protect them even more. And then when those really tough days are over, you can just go out and remove the soil again. So that's being proactive. You can also do it like that. But for most of you who just want to plant things in most environments and leave it alone, I'll say right around here, those 5 centimeters above the crown, it will anchor the rose nicely, protect it against the winter very nicely, and also it is not deep enough to cause it to rot. So in my opinion, after trying many different methods, I find this to be the best way. So yeah, guys, that was quickly how to estimate the correct planting height, and right around here. I think this way is much easier than showing me standing over a hole, because you usually can't see what is going on. But let's continue. Now, If you do find you can't plant the roses before the frost arrives, for example, I'll have -4 degrees tomorrow, please do remember to bring your roses inside in either an unheated room or a place that is as close to 5 to 10 degrees as possible. So we'll bring these roses down into the basement now to protect them from the winter frost, because we don't want these freezing in their pots. That is very unhealthy for roses, so we'll bring them inside now. Now I have just brought my Bareroot roses down here in the basement, where there's no more than, I would say, 10 degrees at maximum. And this is perfect. The closer you can get to these 5 to 6 degrees, the better. The reason we still want to keep them cold is we don't want to encourage them to begin shooting, to begin activating the little nodes, the little buds, and begin shooting. We don't want them to believe that it is spring now and they can come out of hibernation. That is why we still want to keep them relatively cold. But we don't want to leave them outside in the winter in these water buckets and completely freeze, because that is also very damaging to the rose. I can compare it to something you're all familiar with. If you're stuck outside in water and it is freezing, how long do you think you'll survive? Probably not that long. And why is that? It is because water freezes extremely fast. It is very, very conductive to temperature changes. And another thing is that roses, just like you, prefer to be under a nice duvet, a nice pillow. They prefer to have their roots on the soil, because frost doesn't reach the root very fast on the soil. And the thing to remember is, even though plants do have their own antifreeze, the antifreeze is mainly in the stems of the roses. Plants use certain hormones, they use salt, they use certain proteins to create their own antifreeze. And essentially what this does is it prevents the ice crystals from forming inside the plant cells. But you also have to remember, not every part of the plant contains a lot of this antifreeze. Something like the roots, for example, are meant to be very nimble, they're meant to absorb water, and they're meant to be below soil. So they don't have a lot of this naturally occurring antifreeze. Because they are meant for a different role. They're not meant to be stuck above soil level in water and freeze. They're meant to be under a nice little duvet. They're meant to be under the soil where temperature changes doesn't happen that rapidly. And that's another thing about the plant's natural antifreeze. The plant does need a little bit of time to change into a different metabolism. It can't just deal with a huge temperature change from day one. So please do protect your roses against standing in water and freezing, because it will destroy the cells in their roots by forming ice crystals, and they're not meant to be outside in the frost with the roots exposed. The roots are meant to be nice and comfy on the soil. And another thing I will say is, you also have to remember that you won't see the damage right away. Often frost damage you will first see in March and April, when the plants begin coming alive. And then they'll turn black all of a sudden, the stems will turn black, it'll turn mushy, and then you'll first notice the damage there. So just because you left your roses outside in the really hard frost, don't assume that means you're in the clear, because in my experience it often means you're losing like 1/3 of what you left out there. And it is the same with water, right? You don't want to leave your roses out there for 5 days in the water, because that usually means you lose 1/3 of all your roses in that bucket. So please don't go experimenting with this on rose types you like. You can run your own experiments with roses you don't like. But trust me for now when I say you don't really want to leave them longer in the water than, I would say, 48 hours. Maybe you'll be okay with 3 days, but really don't go above it, and try to attempt faith, and really don't leave them outside in a freezing bucket. It will form ice crystals. The ice crystals will go inside the plant cells. They will shatter, and when they start to unthaw, you will have damage. So, but let's continue here. You can also keep a few bags of sand like I have here. That's because I have experienced before that sometimes you get your roses delivered during January, where you don't know how many weeks it's going to be freezing for. And then you'll be really happy you have kept some sand somewhere that doesn't freeze, and you can open the sandbags and you can put your roses into a nice bucket, a plastic bucket, and you can just pour some sand over them and cover the roots with that, and you can kind of give them a little bit of water, and they'll usually be fine for nearly 4 weeks, which will give you plenty of time to get those roses in the ground. So keeping a few bags of sand frost free, you can put into a plastic bucket and pour over your Bareroot roses. If you get your roses in an inconvenient time frame, can also work out really well for you. Now, another thing you can do if you don't have time, or frost is coming, is simply take all your roses, like a bunch of them, dig a very deep hole and just put them all down there like that, and then you simply cover them all with soil, and that will also help them survive. Like, you can plant 15 of them together in a hole like this, and that will help them survive for like 3 to 4 weeks also. So that's also a good way if you can get into the ground and you don't have time to dig individual holes. Simply dig one deep hole and throw the whole bunch down there. It doesn't matter if they're 10 to 15 roses together. They can last in there for like 3 to 4 weeks together easily. Now, if you want to use this hole for a single Bareroot rose, you simply come in there with your pitchfork or something else, and you kind of loosen it at the deep end, so you make sure that that soil is nice and loose, because you have to remember that the roots needs an easy time going through the soil, so we want to loosen it and provide a lot of air down there. And also, if you have very heavy soil like me, I have very heavy clay soil, you often want to put in a little bit of soil amendment and just mix it around with your normal garden soil like that. And if you have some microfungal spores or some what is called mycorrhizal or something like that, you simply put it on the roots and you put it into the hole. Ideal planting height right around here, 5 centimeters under the soil with the crown. And that is how you plant a Bareroot rose. Now, you might want to take this plant sign and move it all the way up here to avoid it being in the soil, so you can't see it. Oftentimes when the roses come, it's all the way down here at the base. So I find moving it up here helps you see it while it's still above ground. And you simply just cover the rose like this. Remember to keep the crown 5 centimeters under. And you simply just cover the rose from all sides here, keeping it firmly in place. Now, here's one important and crucial detail. You don't want to leave a kind of burrow in the ground, because if you leave this kind of hole, what will happen is all the water will go here, and then the rose will be completely swamped by water all winter. So you want to give it level, plain with the ground as much as possible. And you also want to be really careful you get this part in here covered, because sometimes the branches can get in the way of getting soil all the way in there. And one thing I really like to do is I like to make the mound a little higher here in the middle. So I like to take a little bit of soil and put in there to protect that crown. And that is about the final result. I'm just going to even it out a bit more here to prevent the water. And that will be that. That is how you plant a rose. And you can see it is nice and softly tucked all the way in there. No exposed crown. And these rose stems will go on to form white roots and root into the ground. And that is how you plant a bareroot rose. Now some people do like to stomp the ground afterwards with boots, kind of like this with the heel or with the fingers. I really don't tend to do that as much because on clay soil I want to secure airflow. And I find if I go too much stomping like this, what will happen is the soil gets too compact. But if you're on sand soil, definitely press it in a little bit because your soil is naturally loose. Now let's go over the 3 different ways that people usually kill their roses. The first one is hydration. This is where most people commit a lot of mistakes. You have to remember that your rose has been on the way to your house for 3 to 5 days. And even though that plastic bag it has been stuck in has done its best to keep the moisture trapped around the roots, the rose is still dehydrated. It needs some water. And that is why we place them in these plastic buckets and we hydrate them for up to 48 hours. You hydrate the rose up to around the crown point and not up to the green stems. The green stems shouldn't go underwater, only the roots. Now, what a lot of people get wrong here is they often tend to forget their roses. Either something else happens or they don't have the time, and we sometimes as human beings have many excuses and many things that can go wrong. But what I will stress is that you usually have 48 hours from you put the rose in the water bucket to it needs to go out of the water bucket. You have 48 hours. The first 24 hours is the most beneficial part of the hydration phase for the plant, but up to around 48 hours the plant really doesn't mind being in the water. The issue comes when you go beyond 48 hours. What gradually starts happening is the plant loses oxygen and it starts choking, and the feeder roots start swelling up and they begin rotting. That's why you don't want to leave the rose stuck in water for more than 48 hours. You can probably get away with 3 days, but you will have some minor damage, and if you go too far, maybe 7 days, even 5 days, you have done some serious damage to your roses often. And the sad news about it is you will usually not know about it until spring comes around. Because your roses first starts becoming active around spring, and that is when those black stems and those other things, those rotting things will occur, and you will go like, oh, why does that occur? It comes out of nowhere. And that can in part be because you didn't stick to this planting phase, this bareroot planting phase correctly. You'll usually know about it in spring. Usually what happens in my experience is 1/3 of the bareroot roses will suddenly go bad on you because you left them too long in the water. Usually it doesn't kill all of them, just 1/3 of them. And you will know about it, and usually you'll start seeing weak growth in March, and by April you'll start seeing this rotting tendency if they have gotten damaged a lot. Another thing I'll say is, even though it's very natural to be curious and want to open the plastic bag right away, do remember when you open that bag, and if you keep it open, you let all the moisture out. So maybe you do want to add a little bit of moisture in there again if you had the bag open for a long period of time. A lot of plant breeders do say you can leave them for sometimes 2 weeks in these plastic bags, which honestly I think is a long time. Of course you can do it, but the real question to me is, do you really want to take a risk, even if it is just a 5% risk of it going wrong? In my opinion, usually get them in the ground as soon as you receive them. There's many reasons for me giving you this recommendation. Another reason I haven't gone into too much is because there's also a microbiome living on your plant's roots, and the more that microbiome is out of the soil, the quicker it will die off and your roots will have no microbiome. So really do remember to get your roses in the soil as soon as possible after the hydration phase. And do remember 48 hours is kind of the cutoff point for when it stops being beneficial to start being harmful. And then also remember to not leave your roses exposed to the air for too long because you're looking at them and stuff like that. Really close that bag up, that plastic bag, and make sure if you had it open for a long time to maybe take one of these, maybe a few drops of water back in the bag again, so there's something to keep the moisture level up. Moisture is so important when you have exposed roots. But that was phase 1, hydration. It is the phase most people get wrong, either because they believe a longer time spent for the rose sitting around in the water will mean the rose is happier. They want to be really good to the rose and give it a really nice drink. And then they just forget that roses also need oxygen. Or people are kind of lazy, like I can also sometimes be, I admit, and they leave them around for too long, or they kind of forget about them and something gets in the way. So this is a really crucial phase to really stay disciplined and get everything together. And I know that can sometimes be hard because a lot of times these Bareroot roses will show up when you don't expect them to show up, because usually you don't pick the time yourself. Maybe you have booked a vacation, maybe you have a lot of family birthdays like I have just had. I've had 2 family birthdays and I have received Bareroot roses in the meantime. And what you really want to do in that case is you will dig a hole, you'll put all the roses down there, you'll cover it in the soil. But let's continue here. Now let's go over the second reason people usually kill the Bareroot roses. And that second reason is frost. People have a tendency to kind of panic when they get the Bareroot roses when the soil is frozen. And they'll go out there with the heaviest shovel they can find or something else, and they'll try to dig holes into the frozen soil, and they'll plant the roses down into the hole after much effort. Now, why is that a bad idea? Well, it's a bad idea for 2 reasons. One is that all the water in the soil is kind of bound up into ice crystals, so there's not a lot of hydration for the rose. But an equally as important point why it's a bad idea is that the frozen soil after a while will usually push the rose upwards because the soil wasn't fit as compact or as nicely around the plant when you kind of dig these frozen holes. So what can end up happening is the soil simply pushing the rose up when it goes through these 4-on-4 cycles. So really avoid planting in frozen soil. Now, the next reason people usually kill their plants with the frost is waterlogged soil. Waterlogged soil is again a very bad idea for the same reason. Leaving your roses stuck in a water pot while it freezes is a bad idea. The reason for that is it is much easier for a root system to freeze when they become waterlogged, because ice crystals can form inside the feeder roots, and the feeder roots can get destroyed, and then they'll rot in the spring, and then the rose will have no way to absorb anything, and it can quickly die during the springtime. So really remember that you don't want your rose to be stuck in any kind of water that is very freezing. And the second reason is, of course, as I've gone over many times, roses need oxygen. They simply do. And I think an important point is to, as I always say, think holistically. It is the reason I often explain to you a lot of different scenarios so you can learn thinking from yourself. It is the reason at the start of this video I didn't just show you one planting depth. I showed you multiple for different kind of scenarios. If you live in Australia, or if you, God forbid, live on the North Pole and try to grow roses nearly. But what I really want to have happening here is you learning to think for yourself. It's kind of like the soil amendment I use. I only use some kind of light soil amendment because I'm on clay soil. But if you're on a sandy soil, you may want to add something that keeps the water instead, something like clay or something like. So always think about what kind of soil you're also dealing with on your in your house, and really think about the whole scenario. Like I said before, think about how long your rose has been dehydrated. Think about the weather outside. Take all these factors into consideration, and you really have to learn to think for yourself. It is the only way you'll become a really good gardener. It is if you learn to take all these variables and come to your own conclusions, because there's not one answer that fits all. And even though it will be very easy for me to tell everyone to just go bury their Bareroot roses 5 centimeters on the ground from the crown, I didn't choose to do that simply because it would maybe be good advice for 80% of you out there growing roses, but for the 20% it might be terrible advice. So that is really why you should be very careful to just listen to one particular type of video if there's not the full nuance. And that's really why this video will have to be long, because I want it to have the nuance it needs. But frost, do remember to respect it. Also remember to always pick roses for your hardiness zone. It doesn't... I know the temptation. I'm also growing some roses that are right on the edge of what I'm able to grow. For me, that's usually around minus 15 Celsius. I grow some roses that can only go down to minus 15 Celsius, even though I know I'm in an area that can get minus 22 Celsius. So when that happens, I know that the price will be that I have to go out into the garden and I'll have to kind of dig a little hill of soil on top of the rose to protect it, and or I can leave some branches or something around the crown to protect the rose, and then during springtime I'll remove that. So you can definitely get away with growing some roses that are right on the edge of your hardness zone. But my general recommendation is always choose roses that are like one hardiness zone under your area. So if you're in zone 7B, maybe only grow roses that are 6B, because then you have a little bit of a security. You have a little bit of safe zone there if things go horribly wrong. And sometimes your roses are a bit weak, like if you get young rose plants, they might not even be able to go down to that level that a real fully grown plant can. So always assume that your roses are a little less frost hardy than they are, simply because to be on the safe side. But really respect the frost. It can kill your plants, especially if the frost and water situation happens at the same time. That's why I made a video I can't remember if it was months or weeks back, where I explained that waterlogged soil can kill just as many of your roses during the winter months as the freezing itself. So it is a very dangerous combination that you will have to pay a great deal of respect to, in my opinion. But let's continue here. Reason number 3 why people kill their roses. It is usually due to them not knowing how to plant roses. There's a lot of mistakes you can do when planting your Bareroot roses. And let's go over some of the common mistakes. The first common mistake is not getting the crown of the rose to the correct depth. The crown of the rose is this part here. You can see like a crown. It's part where you have the node and every stem goes from it, forming a crown. That's why we call it the crown of the rose. But if you don't get the crown deep enough in the soil, it can become exposed to the frost, and that can kill off the crown and therefore kill off the rose. But another thing that can also happen is that the crown can split, like the frost can really get in there, dehydrate it, and the crown may split. The wood may split on the crown. So you always want to keep your crown at a certain depth. I find 5 centimeters to be my preference because I find it to be the ideal height between protecting from the frost and avoiding most of the rotting situation. But you can experiment a little bit with that and find the ideal for your area. But that is my default recommendation, putting the crown 5 centimeters under the soil. Now, if you get the crown too far up over the soil, what can also happen is you get these wild shoots. If you live in an area where roses are often grafted onto different roots to provide different benefits. In Europe, it's often multiflora. In US, it is Dr. Huey. But what will happen is you will get wild shoots from these original roots that your roses are grafted on, and you can usually spot them because something like multiflora often have more leaves. Instead of 5 leaves, it might be 7 leaves. So that is a clear indication that what you're dealing with is a wild shoot. So there's many reasons to getting the planting height of the crown correct, and it can definitely either make it a very pleasant experience to grow a rose or a very unpleasant experience to grow a rose. And in my opinion, if in doubt, go with 5 centimeters below soil level for the crown. Start out with that, see how it goes. If you have too much dieback from the winter, you can plant it a bit deeper. If they're okay, but you have more of a rotting situation going on, you can plant it a bit higher if you're living somewhere warmer. So really experiment with that. But my default recommendation is 5 centimeters below soil level. Also because you want to prevent this rocking emotion from the wind. You want those added roots going out from the bottom of the stems by burrowing a bit deeper, so you don't get the rose sitting like this and being moved about and breaking roots in the wind. So you do want to anchor it decently well in the soil to prevent that situation, and also to prevent dehydration, because if you don't bury it decently well, you leave air pockets, or you have this situation going on, it can lead to a lot of damage to your rose. So getting the burying technique correct, getting the planting technique of roses correct, is a bit of an art form. You will have to figure out what works for you. For me, I find the most balanced approach, and the one I go with the most for a rose I really don't know how to grow, or a new rose in my garden. I usually plant it 5 centimeters below soil level, and I find after I started doing that, the first year I started out with roses, I would actually put the crown right on soil level, so you had the crown at the same level as soil level, and that was not as successful for me as planting it 5 centimeters under, because I needed that extra bit of frost protection from living in Scandinavia. But also I found the roses simply grew better because the crown was not as exposed, and it was more anchored against the strong winds here also. So you really have to think about your scenario, but getting the planting depth incorrectly for your area is definitely a way to make your situation more difficult. But in general, I find that going with around 5 centimeters below soil level for the crown, it usually doesn't hurt the rose, and it's kind of like Buddha once said, you have that golden mean between two extremes, and for me the one extreme is leaving the rose with the crown all the way at soil level, because that leaves it exposed to many things, and the other extreme is planting it very, very deeply,
which leaves it prone to rotting. You have that golden mean, and for me, it is right around 5 centimeters below soil level. Could it be 7 centimeters? Maybe. If 7 centimeters work for you, please do. I don't always take it that accurately. I know about 2 fingers, maybe 3 if I'm really pushing it when I'm out in the garden, and the rose is usually fine. If it's 5, 6, or 7 centimeters, don't worry too much about it. Just aim for around 5 centimeters. You can water the rose after planting it if your soil is not as wet as mine is. I never have an issue with dry soil during the winter. Mine is always decently wet. I'm on clay soil and I'm in Scandinavia. But please do remember, if you're planting roses and you're living somewhere very dry, very sunny, do remember, after you have planted your Bareroot roses, after you are tucked in the ground a little bit, in my opinion, not too firm but not too firm. Remember, you don't want to choke off the airflow. You just want to keep out the worst air pockets down there, but you really don't want to destroy the airflow. So please don't go stomping it like you're doing a professional concrete foundation or something. You don't want it that airtight. But you do want those air pockets out of there, and if you live somewhere very dry, you do want to add a little bit of water after planting. I just don't do that because I live in a place that gets extremely wet during the winter, and I don't want to be adding any more moisture to the soil than it already has. But yeah, there's a lot of mistakes you can make, but don't be afraid to go for it. It is really something you get a lot of experience with as you learn growing, and I can almost guarantee you that you will kill a few roses. There's no way to avoid it, really. It's like in the wine business, we sometimes laugh about when people drop the first bucket of wine, really, or the first wine bottle, right? And it goes splash and glass goes everywhere, and people are always really, really in a panic mode when that happens the first time. But really, it is the cost of business, really. If you're planting a lot of roses, if you're planting roses in general, you will sooner or later have a rose that simply dies on you. It can be the weather, it can be your planting technique, it can also be the condition it was delivered in from the breeders. And that is another point. If you get one of those roses that only have like 2 small stems, that really does impact the survival odds of it over the winter. Usually they're okay, but they're a bit more tricky to get through the winter. They usually pull through, but I would say that most of the roses that die on me in a winter situation are those kind of weaker ones with only 2 stems. So they are definitely a bit tougher if you don't give them ideal circumstances, but you can definitely do it. But yeah, guys, I think I'll also go a little bit into the bacteria you put on the rose, the microfungi, or these kind of like what I call mycorrhizal or something like that in English. You have to forgive my Scandinavian sometimes. Sometimes the Scandinavian word pops up into my mind when it comes to these more professional terms. But it definitely helps spraying the roots with that if you have it. I didn't have it here today. And also there's often a limited time period where that stuff is good for. Usually it expires very quickly, so don't go buying a massive amount of it because you usually can't store it that long because it's live organisms. But it does help a bit, especially if you have had the roots of the roses out of the soil for a long period of time and the microbiome on the roots have died off. It definitely helps, but it is a nice to have, not a need to have. It helps. It will probably do 5%, but it is also expensive. It is a trade-off. If you want to do that, that's completely up to you. What you do is kind of like Parmesan cheese. You get a small sassel of these microfungi and kind of spray it on the roots like that. Kind of like Parmesan cheese when you're making food at home. So don't worry about it. It is very easy to do if you want to do that. And but really make sure that the soil is loosed in the bottom, that the planting depth is correct. If you need to water it. It is again the thing I've been explaining time and time again. You need to think holistically. You need to think what the rose has just been through and what it needs in the current moment and how the weather is outside, if you want to get good at rose growing. And of course, you can also do some damage to the roses when it comes to pruning techniques. But usually that just leads to you getting less flowers. Pruning techniques is something I'll go over during the spring. In general, the things to be really careful with are the historic roses. If you have bought Jack Cartier or Rose de Reche, you have nothing to worry about. But if you have bought something like Madame Hardy and a few others of these really old historic roses, you do need to know a certain pruning technique for growing old historic roses. But that is something I'll go over during the springtime. Since you stuck around, I thought I would mention 3 more mistakes that I could think about. The first mistake is getting the wrong pH soil for your plants. Roses tend to prefer very neutral soil. They tend to prefer soil around 6 to 6.5 on the pH scale. And they don't like when you go into alkaline, like 7.5 and above. They really don't like when you go into the acidic, like 5.5 and below. And sadly, often people just buy the cheapest soil. And sometimes they go home with a rhododendron or azalea soil, something that can be like a 2.5, 3.5 on the pH level. And the issue is when the pH level of your soil is wrong, what happens to roses is they have a very hard time absorbing micronutrients. It can be something like iron, it can be something like magnesium. All these different kinds of macronutrients are very hard for the roses to absorb when they're in the wrong pH level environment. So really do remember to read the backside of the plastic bag with soil, what the pH level is of that soil, and try to get as close to 6.5 as possible. You want a very neutral soil when dealing with roses to make sure they absorb nutrients correctly. The second thing I often see as a mistake, as a bonus mistake I often see people do, is they want to really take care of the roses, or at least they think so, and then they throw artificial fertilizer down into the planting hole, or they throw some kind of manure, some kind of compost down into the planting hole during winter. And the issue with that is that will actually burn the roots. You don't want to be adding fertilizer anytime during the winter, and you especially don't want to add fertilizer or compost or anything directly down into the root zone, because that will burn the roots. So please do remember to be mindful that you do want to fertilize your roses, but never during the winter time. First in springtime you want to start out with some nitrogen, and then after that you want to move more towards the phosphorus and the potassium kalium to encourage flowering. First to encourage stem formation and later to encourage flowering. But do remember, during the winter time there's no need for fertilizer, so don't use artificial fertilizer or any kind of manure down into the planting hole. The second mistake, the third mistake people often can make is they'll cut the canes down too short. And the issue is the canes actually do store energy, and the more of the canes you cut off, the more of the available energy for the rose you destroy. So cutting your canes back too harshly during autumn, before the rose has or beginning winter, before the rose has had time to really store all that energy down towards the roots, can also be harmful. You don't need to disturb your roses more than you have to. You can also cut them back in February without any problems, or sometimes you can even get away with March, but in February, usually late February, it is a better time to cut off the canes, because the canes do store a lot of energy for the rows, and if you cut them off, that is less available energy. And that is also why, as I explained before, that a rose with 2 canes can sometimes have a little bit harder of a time to survive than a rose with 3 or 5 canes, because canes do store energy, and it matters a lot to the rose. And I also like to leave my canes a little bit longer for the winter, because my experience is often that the first 5 to 10 centimeters of the cane will freeze down if you live somewhere colder like me, and I don't want that frost damage to reach too far down. So I do tend to leave my canes around these at least 15 to 20 centimeters. I even leave the original rose canes. I don't really cut my roses before we're entering February, because I want the plant to have as much of its available nutrients and as much as possible of its original energy storage left. The only exception is if I have a really large rose, very tall rose, and I'm very worried that the winter wind will snap it or snow will cover it and break it. In that case, I might cut it a bit back to avoid that. But really think about what you're doing, and these are also some mistakes I see people do. So yeah, guys, this is really it. Take care out there.